She built his empire with her bare hands, and he thanked her by handing her crown to another woman. Luna Seraphine Ashmore didn't scream, didn't shatter her wine glass across the marble floor, didn't claw the smirk off Lady Elira's perfect face. She stood in front of 500 nobles and warriors, back straight, jaw locked, eyes dry as desert bone, and she bowed. That bow cost her everything she had left. But here's what Kaelin Draven never understood about the woman he broke that night. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is a woman deciding, very quietly, that she is done. Stay until the end. You're going to want to see what she does next. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching this from. The banquet hall smelled like roasted boar, pine resin torches, and ambition. Seraphine had chosen the decor herself. Dark ironwood tables draped in deep crimson cloth, wolfsbane flowers pressed into long centerpiece arrangements because Kaelin had once told her, years ago, that he hated roses. She'd remembered. She always remembered. That was the particular cruelty of loving someone the way she had loved him. She catalogued every preference, every quiet complaint, every offhand remark he made between battles, and she shaped the world around him accordingly. 5 years of that. 5 years of building the Draven Empire from the scorched skeleton it had been when she arrived as a 19-year-old girl from the northern borderlands, already mated, already terrified, already trying to be enough. She stood near the head table and watched the hall fill. The great houses of the empire moved through the doors in order of rank. House Vale in their silver-threaded coats, House Carrick trailing their enormous war dogs, House Marion with their merchant wealth barely disguised beneath polished manners. They all greeted her with the particular deference reserved for queens, eyes down, a half bow, the formal address delivered in clipped imperial dravish. Luna Seraphine Ashmore, first queen of the Iron Covenant. She'd earned every syllable of that title in ways most of them would never know. She shook hands and smiled and made the rounds and accepted the compliments about the hall's decoration, the anniversary menu, the seating arrangements she'd personally revised 3 times, because General Holt and Treasurer Wavrin would start a territorial dispute if they sat within eyeline of each other. Across the room, she could feel Kaelin before she saw him. That was the mate bond, a thread of warmth and pressure that lived behind her sternum. A compass that had always pointed toward him whether she wanted it to or not. She felt him the way she felt weather changing. A shift in the air, a tightening in her chest, a low hum of awareness that used to feel like home. It didn't feel like home anymore. She wasn't sure when it had stopped. He came through the main arch flanked by his war council. Commander Thrace on his left, Lord Advisor Brant on his right, both men walking with the careful deference of people who have learned exactly how close to get without blocking the view. Kaelin Draven was the kind of man rooms reorganized themselves around. Tall, wide through the shoulder, with the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from complete certainty that whatever he decided would happen. He wore black, as always. His dark hair was cut shorter than she remembered from the last time she'd been close enough to notice. His jaw was harder. The war in the East had done that. Ground something soft out of him, left the angles sharper. She had held him through the nightmares after the Eastern campaign. 3 weeks of waking in the dark to the sound of his breathing going wrong, to the weight of him rolling toward her in sleep like a man reaching for the only solid thing left. She had not slept properly for a month. She had not told anyone. He found her eyes across the hall. Something moved through the mate bond. Brief, complicated, not quite warmth and not quite guilt. She held the contact for exactly as long as courtesy required, and then looked away. Dinner proceeded without incident. Seraphine ate very little, spoke to her table mates with the specific quality of attention she had cultivated over years of diplomatic necessity, full presence, careful listening, the art of making a person feel briefly singular, and she tracked the room's rhythms the way she always did. Who was drinking too fast? Which alliances were fraying at the edges, where the tension was pooling. She noticed that Lady Elira arrived late. That was the first thread she pulled. Elira Voss was the youngest daughter of House Voss, a mid-tier noble family from the southern reaches that had gained considerable wealth and influence in the years since Kaelin consolidated the trade routes that Seraphine had personally negotiated, but no one kept that particular ledger. Alira was beautiful in the way that seemed effortless, but wasn't, the kind of beauty that required substantial effort and the wisdom to never let that effort show. She wore pale gold. Her hair was dark and elaborately dressed. She moved through the room with the particular confidence of someone who already knew what was coming. Seraphine watched her find her seat, not at the lower tables where House Voss typically placed, but at the head tier, 2 seats down from Kaylin's right hand. The second thread. She set down her fork. She picked up her wine. She did not drink it. Seraphine, Kaylin's voice from the head of the table. Come sit beside me. The request broke protocol. She was already seated at his left. What he was asking her to do was stand, walk around the table in front of 500 people, and take the chair that had just been vacated on his immediate right, the chair directly beside Alira Voss. She understood then, with a clarity that hit somewhere below the ribs, that this had been arranged. All of it. The seating, the delay, the placement. Whatever was about to happen, it had been rehearsed. She stood. She smoothed her gown, deep navy, simply cut. The kind of thing she wore when she wanted to be taken seriously rather than admired. She walked around the table with her spine straight and her face arranged in the diplomatic neutrality she had spent years learning to hold like a weapon. She sat. Kaylin poured her wine himself. That was unusual. His hands were steady. You've outdone yourself tonight, he said. Quiet, just between them. The hall looks exceptional. Thank you. She studied the table in front of her. The wolfsbane flowers in the centerpiece were starting to wilt at the edges. She'd noticed that earlier and arranged for fresh ones to be brought before the dessert course. She didn't know if anyone had remembered. Are you well? The question landed strangely. He hadn't asked her that, and she couldn't calculate it without it becoming a wound she didn't have time to nurse. I'm fine, she said. You seem tense. He exhaled. There's something I need to tell the court tonight. Then tell them. He turned to look at her. She made herself hold the look, kept her expression even, kept her breathing steady, kept the mate bond's warmth from reaching her face. There was something in his eyes she didn't have a name for. Not guilt, exactly, not apology. More like the look of a man who has already decided and is now looking for the right arrangement of words to make that decision sound inevitable. She had seen that look before. In the months after the Eastern Campaign, when he'd started spending late nights with the War Council and stopped coming to bed until long after she'd given up waiting. When the reports about the alliance negotiations with House Voss had started coming in with details she hadn't been consulted on. When she'd begun finding that the small threads of information that used to flow to her naturally, because she'd built those information channels herself, because half the kingdom's administrators reported to her first out of habit and relationship, had started rerouting around her without explanation. She had pulled those threads. She had noticed things. She had told herself she was being paranoid. She had been wrong about that. It concerns the kingdom's future, Kaylin said. The consolidation of our alliances. Of course it does, she said. He rose to his feet. The hall quieted. That was what authority like his did. It simply required attention, didn't ask. 500 conversations died in under 30 seconds, and the only sounds left were the torches and the distant shift of a war dog resettling beside its master's chair. Lords and ladies of the Iron Covenant, Kaylin said. His voice carried without effort. Warriors, administrators, allies. 11 years ago, this empire was 3 fractured territories and a debt that would have taken a generation to repay. Tonight we celebrate what we've built. Together. He paused. The right length. He always knew the right length. Our prosperity has been hard won. You know the cost. We've buried men in soil that used to be contested ground and turned that soil into something we can pass to our children. That work doesn't stop. The empire requires continued strength, continued unity. And tonight I announce an alliance that will secure our southern territories for the next generation. Seraphine's fingers found the edge of the table beneath the cloth. Lady Alira Voss has agreed to join the Draven line, Kaylin said. For the future of the kingdom, I will take her as my second queen. The applause began before he finished the sentence. It moved through the hall in a wave. Not universal, but substantial, led by the houses that had most to gain from a Voss alliance and joined by the people who applauded things simply because applause was expected of them. The War Council looked straight ahead. Lord Advisor Brant was examining the middle distance with tremendous intensity. Commander Thrace had the expression of a man who has been told something he disagrees with and decided this is not the moment to say so. Seraphine sat with her hand pressed flat against the table and her face absolutely still. The mate bond pulsed, once, hard, and then she locked it down with the same muscle she'd used 100 times before, the one that let her sit at council tables where her word was questioned and her counsel was occasionally credited to someone else, and her husband's attention drifted toward things that weren't her and simply continued to function. The muscle was very strong by now. She'd had a lot of practice. Elira stood from her seat 2 chairs down and turned toward the room with a grace that had clearly been rehearsed. She was younger than Seraphine had thought, mid-20s maybe, beautiful and careful and very, very prepared for this moment. She looked at the hall with the expression of someone who has been told this is the beginning of her story. Kaelin was still standing. He turned to Seraphine now, in front of everyone. "Seraphine," he said. His voice was the voice he used for announcements. Public, projected, perfectly controlled. "I trust you'll welcome Lady Elira as a partner in governing this kingdom. Your experience and her alliance will serve us well." The room was watching her. 500 faces, arranged in a spectrum from careful neutrality to unconcealed curiosity, waiting to see what the First Queen would do when she was publicly instructed to welcome the woman who was replacing her. This was the calculation he had made. She understood that now with full clarity, that the public setting was not incidental. It was structural. In front of this court, in this hall, with these witnesses, there was only one acceptable response from a queen who understood duty, who had spent 11 years framing her entire identity around service to this empire. There was only one response that didn't destabilize everything she'd built, didn't fracture the alliances that ran through her personally, didn't hand ammunition to the houses that had always resented her northern bloodline. He had cornered her with her own reputation. She stood. "Lady Elira." Her voice was level, the kind of level that took everything she had. "Welcome to the Draven Court." She bowed, not deep, not servile. A queen's bow, spine straight, chin only as low as protocol required, back up again in under 3 seconds. But it was a bow. In front of 500 witnesses. To the woman who had just been announced as her replacement, while her husband watched from 2 feet away with the expression of a man who had gotten what he wanted and was already moving on to the next problem. The applause resumed. Seraphine sat back down. She found her wine. She drank it. She did not look at Kaelin again for the rest of the evening. The night stretched long. The dessert course came, the speeches came. General Holt managed not to look directly at Treasurer Wavrin, which Seraphine noted as a small administrative victory she would never get credit for. House Carrick's youngest representative drank considerably too much and needed to be quietly redirected before he decided to make a toast of his own composition. Seraphine handled all of it from her seat with gestures and brief eye contact to the right staff, the same way she always handled the things that needed to not become visible problems. She was very good at keeping things from becoming visible problems. Around the 3rd hour, when the hall had relaxed into the looser rhythms of late-night conversation and the formal portion of the evening was clearly over, Lady Marin Vale materialized at her elbow. Marin was 63, narrow-faced and brilliant, the matriarch of the most powerful house in the Empire's eastern territories, and the person Seraphine considered the closest thing to an ally she had at court. They had never discussed anything personal. They didn't need to. "Seraphine," Marin said. "Marin." That was elegantly managed, a pause that contained several layers of meaning. "The bow." "It was a bow," Seraphine said. "Yes." Marin looked out at the room. "It was exactly that." Seraphine turned to look at her. Marin's expression was the carefully arranged blankness of a woman who has survived courts for 4 decades by being very precise about what she let her face do. "Say what you came to say," Seraphine said. "I came to compliment the centerpieces," Marin said. "The wolfsbane is a nice touch, unusual choice. He doesn't like roses." "No." A beat. "He doesn't deserve wolfsbane either, but that was never really the point with you, was it?" It wasn't a question. Seraphine didn't answer it. The houses are going to move, Marin said, her voice dropping to the register of pure information, stripped of everything interpretive. The ones that were waiting to see which direction the wind blew. They'll start repositioning toward Voss now. It'll take 6 months, maybe 8, before the real structural shifts show. The funding redirects, the loyalty recalculations. You have time, if you intend to do anything with it. I appreciate the intelligence. It isn't intelligence, Marin said. It's arithmetic. You built half of what holds this empire together. Anyone who's been paying attention knows that. The question is what you're going to do about it. She set her empty glass on a passing tray. Think carefully and get some sleep. You look like you haven't in weeks. She moved away without ceremony, back into the crowd, leaving Seraphine with the particular clarity that comes from having a very intelligent person articulate something you've been refusing to look at directly. She sat with it. The mate bond hummed, low and persistent. Across the room, she could feel Kaelin laughing at something Lord Brant had said, could feel the vibration of it the way you felt a large bell rung in an adjacent room. The bond didn't lie, had never lied, had always reported his emotional state with uncomfortable accuracy regardless of what she wanted to know. He was relaxed. He was satisfied. He was a man who had done a difficult thing and gotten through it and was now enjoying his evening. She felt that and she filed it carefully away, and she stood up and she smoothed her gown and she walked to the door and nodded to the guards and stepped through into the corridor. The corridor was cool and smelled like stone and the guttering wall torches. Her footsteps were quiet on the marble. She walked to the far window that looked out over the eastern garden. Her garden, the one she'd had planted 6 years ago with a horticultural advisor she'd brought up from the Southern Territories specifically because he understood what grew well in iron-rich soil. And she stood in front of it in the dark, and she let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the window ledge and breathed through it, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The technique she'd developed after the second miscarriage, when she'd needed a way to function through grief that didn't interfere with her public schedule. She'd gotten very good at it. The shaking always stopped. She had not told Kaelin about the second miscarriage. He'd been in the East. She'd managed it with her personal healer and her head of household and gone back to work in 3 days. She had not wanted to distract him. She had made a calculation that the Empire needed his focus more than she needed his presence. She thought about that calculation now, in the dark corridor, with her hands pressed flat against the cold stone and the bond behind her sternum pulsing with someone else's satisfaction. It had seemed reasonable at the time. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn. "You left early," Kaelin said. "I needed air." He came to stand beside her at the window, not close enough to touch. She could feel him anyway. Couldn't not feel him. Had never in 11 years been able to not feel him when he was within 20 feet. "You handled tonight well," he said. Something moved through her that she didn't have a name for. It was adjacent to rage, but colder, more structural, like watching a wall you'd built begin to crack from the foundation rather than from any point where you'd applied pressure. "You mean the bow," she said. "I mean all of it. The hall. The dinner. The way you managed the Carrick situation with Wavrin." He paused. "You're extraordinary at this." "I know," she said. A beat of silence. "Seraphine, don't." Her voice was quiet. "Not tonight. I don't want the explanation tonight. The kingdom needed a southern alliance. Elira's house controls the border passes that I know what her house controls." She turned to look at him for the first time since the bow. His face was very close. In the torchlight from the wall sconces, she could see the places where he had aged in the last 5 years, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray beginning at his temples, the particular weight that lived in his expression these days. She knew this face the way she knew her own hands. That was the unbearable part of it. "I understand the strategic rationale. I've understood it since the Voss negotiations started 8 months ago." Something shifted in his expression. "You knew?" "Kaelin." She let a small amount of what she was feeling reach her voice, just enough. "I built the intelligence apparatus that tracks every political negotiation in this empire. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, why didn't you say something?" The question was so genuinely confused, was so much the question of a man who had genuinely not considered what her position in this was, that she almost laughed. She didn't. She turned back to the window. "Because you hadn't told me yet," she said, "and I wasn't sure what telling you would change." "It would have changed." He stopped. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence. She noted that. She filed it away with everything else she had been filing away for longer than she wanted to count. "I still need you," he said finally. "This doesn't change what you are to this empire. To me." "I know," she said. And she did know. She understood exactly what she was to this empire and to him. She'd always had a very clear-eyed assessment of it, and that was the part he didn't understand, had never understood. He thought she needed reassurance of her value. He thought what she was feeling was fear of replacement, the territorial instinct, the thing you consoled with reminders of indispensability. He thought this was about the position. "Go back to your banquet," she said. "Your court is watching." "Seraphine, please," she said. The word came out with more weight than she'd intended. Not a plea, something flatter, something that had given up on arguing its case. "I'd like to be alone for a moment." He stood there for another 10 seconds. She counted them, couldn't help it. And then she heard his footsteps move away, back down the corridor, back toward the warm noise of the hall, and the 500 witnesses, and the woman in gold who had been positioned to replace her with surgical precision and was doing an excellent job of it. She stood at the window until her hands stopped shaking. Then she stood there longer, looking out at the garden she'd built in iron-rich soil, watching the pale wolfsbane flowers bend and recover in the night wind. They were resilient plants. They came back even when the ground was difficult. She'd chosen them partly for that reason. She remembered saying to the horticultural advisor, "I want something that looks like it belongs here but survives anyway." He'd laughed and said she was describing most of the things that grew in the north. She'd laughed too. That had been a good day. She pressed her fingertips against the glass and looked at her own reflection, pale and dark-eyed and very still. And she asked herself, for the first time in full honesty, without the diplomatic filters she applied even to her own internal landscape, what she was actually going to do. Not about Elira, not about Kaelin, not about the court, or the alliances, or the empire she'd spent 11 years building with her hands and her mind and her grief and her silence. About herself. The question sat in the corridor with her and waited, patient as the stone, patient as the wolfsbane in the dark garden, for her to be ready to answer it. 3 days after the banquet, Seraphine summoned her head administrator. His name was Davin Sor, 47, meticulous, the kind of man whose primary virtue was that he understood systems the way musicians understood rhythm. He'd served under her for 6 years. She trusted him completely, which was a rarer thing than it sounded in the Draven court. "Close the door," she said when he arrived. He closed it. "Sit down." He sat across from her at the working table in her private office. Not the formal council chamber, not the throne room annex, but the room she actually used, with the stacked correspondence and the territorial maps marked in 3 colors, and the empty teacup she kept forgetting to return to the kitchen. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to ask you to do something," she said. "I'm going to ask you to do it without asking me why, and without discussing it with anyone, including anyone in the Alpha King's household. If you're not comfortable with that, tell me now and we can pretend this meeting was about the Eastern ledgers." Davin Sor looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had worked beside someone for 6 years and could read the weight of a room very accurately. He said, "What do you need?" She exhaled. "I need a complete inventory," she said, "of every active royal initiative, every pending diplomatic obligation, every administrative process that currently runs through my office or my signature. I need to know the state of everything, every open thread." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a substantial list." "I know." "How complete do you need it?" "Complete," she said. "Every thread, down to the horticultural supply contracts if those run through me." She paused. "Which they do." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask why. He was smart enough to know, she thought, or smart enough to know that he didn't want to know. "Timeline?" he asked. 2 weeks, she said. "Maybe 3. Take what you need." He stood. At the door, he paused. Seraphine. He didn't turn around. Whatever this is, he stopped, started again. You've run this office for 11 years. Whatever I'm helping you document, it's already yours. The record's already there. Anyone who looks will see it. She looked at his back, at the careful set of his shoulders, the slight tension that meant he was working very hard to say the right thing and not quite sure he'd found it. I know, she said. That's not what this is for. He nodded once and left. She turned back to the maps on her table. The Iron Covenant, 37 territories, 4 major trade corridors, 11 noble houses in various states of loyalty and ambition, 200,000 wolves under a banner she had helped make worth following. She pressed her hand flat against the parchment. She could feel the texture of it against her palm. The raised ink of borders, the smooth planes, the rough-cut edges where the mapmaker had trimmed it. She had given this place 11 years, had given it everything she could carry, and several things she shouldn't have tried to carry alone. Now she was going to learn, with precise accounting, exactly what she had given, and then she was going to decide what she would take back. On the 11th night after the banquet, she heard them. She wasn't supposed to. She had developed the careful habit in recent years of not placing herself anywhere she might accidentally hear things she'd rather not. A skill she'd built initially out of self-protection and had since refined into something more like tactical restraint. But the palace was old and the walls in the eastern wing carried sound in ways the architects had never adequately accounted for. And she was returning to her chambers later than usual from the administrative wing when she passed the small receiving room adjacent to the south corridor and heard Kaelin's voice and then Elira's, and then the particular silence between them that had its own sound. She stopped. She stood in the corridor with her hand against the wall and told herself to walk. She didn't walk. Through the wall, worried about her. She's been too quiet. Elira's voice, low and careful. She's always quiet. That's what they say about her. She was quiet tonight at dinner in a different way. Kaelin's voice had the tone she recognized from his private hours. The unguarded register, the one that stripped out the public projection and left just the man underneath. She had heard that voice for 11 years. I know her. When she gets quiet like that, you're worried about her reaction, Elira said. Measured. Neither defensive nor dismissive. That's understandable. It's not just her reaction. A pause. She built things here that I don't fully... He stopped. She understands the kingdom in ways that take years. That I should have... Kaelin, Elira's voice gentled. You made the right decision. For the Empire, you know that. Seraphine stood in the corridor and felt the mate bond pulse with something complicated and warm and directed at the wrong woman, and she understood, with the same cold arithmetic clarity she'd had at the window 3 nights ago, that he was not going to come back from this on his own. Not because he didn't feel something for her. Still, she could feel that he did, could feel it in the way the bond moved when he spoke about her even without knowing she was there. But because he had decided, and because he was the kind of man whose decisions calcified into architecture, and because Elira was exactly smart enough to know that what he needed from her in these moments was not challenge, but confirmation. It was very cleanly done, actually. She peeled herself off the wall. She walked down the corridor, she reached her chambers, and went through the door and stood in the dark and breathed through it, 4 in, 4 out, until her hands were still. Then she sat at her desk and wrote the first letter. Not to anyone in the palace, not to any house, any administrator, any ally within the Empire's borders. She wrote to a woman named Kael Mira, who had once been her mentor and now lived in the uncharted territories 300 miles past the Draven borders, in a stretch of land that didn't appear on any official map because the people who lived there had actively chosen not to be on any official map. She wrote, I am considering something. I want to know if the door is still open. She sealed it. She addressed it in the cipher she and Mira had developed years ago that nobody else in the palace knew because Seraphine had kept it specifically for correspondence she never wanted intercepted. She gave it to her personal messenger, not the royal postal system, not the court courier, her personal messenger, a young woman named Britta who had been in Seraphine's service since before the Eastern campaigns, and who Seraphine paid from her private funds for exactly this reason. No record, she said. Britta tucked the letter into her coat without blinking. Yes, ma'am. After she left, Seraphine sat at the desk for a long time in the dark. Outside, the wolfsbane in the eastern garden bent in the wind and came back up. Bent and came back up. The mate bond was quiet. She pressed 2 fingers against her sternum where it lived and felt it pulse, slow and steady. And she thought about 11 years of building and the cold arithmetic of what she had given and what she had not been given back. And she thought about a woman named Kale Mira, who lived past the borders of any official map. And she thought about the inventory Davin Sor was compiling in the administrative wing, every thread accounted for, every open obligation named. And she thought, I need to know how long it would take to close them all. The answer came to her then, not from outside, but from somewhere deep in the infrastructure of herself, the part that had always been better at counting costs than she'd admitted, and it landed in her chest like cold water. 3 months. Maybe 4, if she was careful. She sat with that number in the dark and felt it change the shape of something she hadn't known she'd been carrying. Then she went to bed. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling of a room she had slept in for 11 years and listened to the palace settle around her, all its stone weight and history and the hundreds of lives that moved through it daily because of work she had done. And she let herself, for the first and only time, feel the full weight of what the evening of the banquet had actually cost her. She let herself feel it completely, every layer. The humiliation and the loneliness and the specific grief of watching someone make a decision about your life and give you no language to object to it, and the worse grief underneath that, the grief of recognizing that you had given someone the tools to corner you so efficiently because you had trusted them with everything you were, and that trust had been real, and it had been used, and there was no clean way to name what that was. She felt all of it. She held it for exactly as long as it needed. And then, very quietly, in the dark of the palace she had built, and the empire she had shaped, and the bed she was going to stop sleeping in, she made a decision. Not a plan. Not yet. A decision underneath the plan. The foundational thing. The load-bearing wall. She was going to leave. Not dramatically. Not in fire. Not in the way that would destabilize the very things she'd built, or give anyone the satisfaction of a collapse they could attribute to her emotion. She was going to leave the way water leaves stone, quietly, persistently, and in such a way that you only understood the depth of the absence when you reached for the place where the water had been and found dry rock. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she slept. The letter from Kale Mira arrived 14 days later, slipped through Britta's hands at the eastern gate in the early gray of a cold morning. Seraphine opened it at her desk before the palace was awake, before the daily briefings, before anyone brought tea or correspondence, or the particular demands of a day that belonged, technically, to the crown. It said, "The door has always been open. I wondered when you'd remember that." She read it twice. She folded it. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the paper between her fingers, and then she set it on the corner of her desk and picked up her pen and pulled the current ledger toward her and went to work. There were 147 open threads in her administrative inventory, according to Davin Sor's count, which was still ongoing. 147 things that needed to be completed, transferred, or closed before she could leave this empire in a state that wouldn't collapse the moment she was gone. She had started on 32. Across the palace, she could feel through the mate bond that Kaelin was still asleep. The bond pulsed with the slow, even rhythm of deep sleep. Uncomplicated, untroubled, the sleep of a man who had made his decisions and was at peace with them. She pressed her hand briefly against her sternum. Then she turned back to the ledger and kept working. Outside the window, past the eastern garden, past the wolfsbane flowers pale in the early light, past the walls of a palace that had been built on ground she'd helped make solid, past all of it, somewhere beyond the borders of every official map, there was a door that had always been open. She was going to walk through it. She just needed to close everything behind her first. The inventory reached 163 items by the time Davin Sor delivered his final count. He set the ledger on her desk without ceremony, which she appreciated. There was no dramatic pause, no searching look, no careful arrangement of his expression into something that asked questions he didn't want answers to. He simply placed it down, said, "Page 41 through 47 is the supplementary list. the oral agreements that never went to formal documentation, and waited. "How many of those?" she asked. 26. She nodded. She did not ask how he felt about the fact that a queen's administrative footprint included 26 agreements that had never been written down because the parties involved trusted her word more than they trusted paper. "Thank you," she said. "That's all." He left. She opened the ledger to page 1 and started reading. This was the 3rd week since the banquet. The palace had already begun to rearrange itself. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be visible to anyone not paying close attention, but she was always paying close attention. Illyra's household staff had moved into the south wing. 3 of the administrative coordinators who had previously reported through Seraphine's office had quietly started routing their morning briefings to Lord Brant instead, which meant Brant had suggested it, and they'd calculated it was safer to comply. The flower arrangements in the main corridor had changed, roses now, long-stemmed and ostentatious, the kind that required replacing every 4 days and cost twice what wolfsbane cost, and told you everything about whoever had ordered them. She read through the ledger. She made notes in the margin in her own shorthand, the cipher nobody else in the palace had bothered to learn because nobody had thought it worth learning. She worked until the candle burned to its last inch, and her tea went cold twice. When she finally stopped, it was past the 2nd bell of night, and she had identified 47 items she could close or transfer within the month. The remaining 116 would take longer, but they would close. She had built them. She understood their bones. She was going to take apart what she'd made with the same precision she'd used to build it. That required patience, which she had always had in supply. It required invisibility, which the court had been providing her for years without knowing it was a resource she'd been saving. The first time Illyra came to her directly, it was the following morning, during the hour Seraphine reserved for personal correspondence. She heard the knock, recognized it as unfamiliar, too deliberate, slightly too long, and said, "Come in," without looking up from the letter she was reading. Illyra entered the way people entered rooms they've decided to own before they've earned them, smoothly, without hesitation, eyes moving across the space in a quick inventory she didn't bother to conceal. She wore pale rose, different from the gold of the banquet, but the same calculated softness. She had a woman with her, a personal attendant who stayed near the door. Seraphine set down the letter. "Lady Illyra," she said. "Queen Illyra," Illyra corrected, gently, the kind of gentle that had a knife in it. Seraphine looked at her for a moment, then she said, "What can I do for you?" Illyra came to stand across the desk, not in the chair reserved for guests, standing, which was a choice, and said, "I wanted to introduce myself properly, without the formality of last night. The banquet was 3 weeks ago. I've been settling in." A small smile. "You understand how it is." "I do." A pause. Illyra's eyes moved across the desk. The stacked correspondence, the open ledger, the cold tea. Taking inventory again. Seraphine recognized the habit because she had the same one. "Kalen speaks very highly of you," Illyra said. "That's kind of him. He says you understand the kingdom better than anyone, that you have a particular talent for managing complexity." "I've had time to develop it," Seraphine said. "Yes." Another pause, this one with more weight in it. "I was hoping you might share some of that complexity with me as I settle into my role. It would be a relief, honestly, to have guidance from someone with your experience." Seraphine looked at her. The request was architecturally perfect. It was framed as deference and vulnerability and an appeal to Seraphine's institutional knowledge, which meant that refusing it sounded like pettiness, and accepting it meant spending hours educating the woman who had taken her place. Either direction was a trap. It had been constructed very carefully. She had underestimated Illyra, she realized. That was a mistake she wouldn't make again. "I have a full schedule this week," Seraphine said, "but I'll make sure you receive the standard administrative briefing packet. Davensor prepares one for all new members of the royal household." The word household was very precise. She watched it land. Illyra's expression didn't shift. "Of course," she said. "Thank you." She turned toward the door, then paused in the way people pause when they've planned the pause. "One more thing. The southern corridor. I understand the formal receiving room there has traditionally been yours. It has? Kalen suggested I might use it for morning audiences. He thought you wouldn't mind, given that your audiences have been a half-beat, consolidating toward the administrative wing. Seraphine held Elira's gaze across the room. The receiving room, the one she had furnished, the one with the territorial maps she'd commissioned from a cartographer in the east because she'd wanted them specific to the inch, where she had held the private conversations that had shaped alliances and resolved disputes, and kept half the noble houses from each other's throats for a decade. Kalen had offered it without asking her. Elira had come to collect it in person. It's the palace's room, Seraphine said. Use it however serves the court best. Elira smiled. You're very gracious. I try to be, Seraphine said. Is there anything else? There wasn't. Elira left, and the door closed, and Seraphine sat in the quiet of her office and breathed. Not through the controlled 4 count, just breathed, normally, the way a person breathes when they're alone and don't need to be performing anything. She picked up her pen. She drew a single line in the margin of the page she'd been on and wrote beside it. Receiving room. Vacate by end of month. Personal effects to storage. She turned the page and kept reading. Oops. The conversation with Kalen happened 4 days later, in the evening, in the study that connected their private quarters, a room that had been theoretically shared for 11 years and practically his for the last 2. She had requested it. That was unusual enough that he arrived at the agreed hour instead of sending word that he was delayed, which she noted. He sat across from her in the chair by the window. She stayed standing. She'd chosen that deliberately, not to create height advantage, but because she needed to be able to move, and sitting across from him in that room felt like accepting a position she was done accepting. The trade agreement with House Fenwick is due for renewal in 6 weeks, she said. I'm transferring management of that to Administrator Corwin in the Eastern office. He has the full file. Kalen looked at her. Why? Because my schedule is restructuring. She moved to the side table and picked up the folder she'd left there. I'm also transferring the Northern Grain Commission to Davin Soar's office and the coastal shipping negotiations to Seraphine. His voice was flat. Stop. She stopped. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and for a moment he just looked at her. The way he used to look at her before the Eastern campaigns, when he still thought looking at her was a way to understand her. What is this? Administrative transfers, she said. I thought it made sense to redistribute some of the workload, given the changes to the household structure. You're pulling back. I'm redistributing. Don't do that. The edge in his voice was quiet but real. Don't give me vocabulary instead of what you mean. She set the folder down. She turned to face him fully. He was watching her with the expression she'd always found the hardest to read, the one that contained something genuine but couldn't name it, couldn't quite push it far enough to become action. What do you want me to say? She asked. I want you to tell me what's actually happening. You restructured the household, she said. I'm restructuring my schedule to reflect that. Those are related events. You're not angry, he said. It came out like an accusation. That's what worries me. You should be angry. Should I? Yes. He stood. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. The posture of a man who needed to look at something that wasn't her face. You've been cold for 3 weeks. You handle everything, you don't miss anything, you're perfectly functional, and you look at me like I'm furniture you've already planned to sell. Something moved through her. She held it. Kalen, she said, what did you want from me? He turned. When you made the announcement, she said, in front of 500 people, with no warning, after 8 months of negotiations, you ran through channels you knew I had access to. What did you actually want me to do? I wanted you to understand, he said. I understood perfectly. No. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. That was the mate bond always, amplifying proximity into something her body registered before her mind could categorize it. You understood the political calculus. That's not what Seraphine, I needed you to what? Her voice was still even. Still the careful diplomatic register, but there was something underneath it now that she'd stopped trying to fully contain. To tell you it was fine? To absorb the announcement and restructure myself around it and keep everything running while you moved on? Because that's what I did, Kaylin. That's exactly what I did. Was there another option you had in mind that I missed? He stared at her. I have never once, she said, in 11 years, asked you to choose me over the Empire. Not once. You know that's true. I know. I managed the East Wing dispute alone. I managed the grain crisis alone. I managed... She stopped, breathed, resumed. Every time you needed the Empire to be functional while you were somewhere else, I held it. Every time. I never asked you to acknowledge it. I never asked you to be grateful. I asked for... She stopped again. What? His voice had gone low, rough. What did you ask for? She looked at him for a long moment. Nothing, she said. That's the answer. I asked for nothing, and that's what I received, and that's a transaction I'm responsible for, not you. I'm not angry at you, Kaylin. I'm accounting. He reached for her arm. She stepped back. Not dramatically, just a small rearrangement of distance. And the movement stopped him more completely than refusal would have. She watched his hand stay in the air for a half-second before he dropped it. What does that mean? He said. Accounting. It means I'm figuring out what I've spent and what I have left. She picked up the folder from the table. The Fenwick file will be with Corwin by the end of the week. I'll send you a full list of the transfers as they complete. Seraphine. She was at the door. Don't do this quietly, he said. Whatever you're doing, don't do it quietly. I can't... He stopped. I can't respond to quiet. She turned. She looked at him across the study, across the room they'd shared and the years it contained and the version of themselves that had existed inside those years, which she was beginning to understand had been more her construction than a true shared thing. I know, she said. She went through the door. The letter to Kale Mira that she sent on the 31st day was not a question. It said, I'll need the route. Eastern Passage, unmarked. I have approximately 60 days. Britta took it at dawn. Seraphine watched her go from the window of the administrative wing, the small figure moving through the courtyard in the gray light, and she felt, not relief exactly, but the particular settlement that comes when a decision made internally finally becomes an action taken in the world. She had closed 71 items from the ledger. 92 remained. In the south wing, Elira's roses were being replaced for the third time, and the receiving room that had been Seraphine's for 11 years now held different furniture. She had not gone to see it. She didn't need to. She knew the dimensions of that room by heart, and she had decided to stop carrying them. In the main corridor, she passed Lady Marin Vale, who looked at her with the sharp, quiet eyes of a woman who had survived 4 decades of courts and recognized a particular kind of stillness when she saw it. Marin said nothing. She simply inclined her head, not the formal court bow, something smaller and more specific, and continued walking. Seraphine continued walking. In 60 days, she thought, give or take. In the throne room behind her, Kaylin was holding morning audience with his war council. Through the mate bond, she could feel his concentration, focused, present, the familiar hum of a man doing the work he was built for. She had loved that about him once, had loved watching him in a room, the way he occupied it, the way people oriented toward him without meaning to. She pressed her fingers against the corridor wall as she walked, letting the cold stone pass under her hand. She was going to stop loving that. She could feel the decision already at work beneath the surface, not erasing what had been there, but rerouting it, the way water rerouted around stone, slow and inevitable and quiet, until the day you looked at the dry ground and realized the river had been gone for longer than you'd tracked. She had 41 days left of this before Britta returned with the route. She was going to spend every one of them working. She turned the corner into the administrative wing, where the morning's correspondence was already stacked and Davensor was waiting with the day's briefing, and the Empire was running the way it always ran, on the infrastructure she had built, on the relationships she had cultivated, on the quiet and continuous work of a woman who had spent 11 years being indispensable in ways that nobody had thought to notice. In 41 days, they were going to start noticing. She picked up the first letter from the stack. She sat down at her desk. She opened it and started reading, and somewhere in the back of her mind, behind everything, behind the accounting and the transfers and the 60-day countdown, a door that had always been open was waiting for her. She was almost ready to walk through it. But first, 92 threads left. She picked up her pen. Britta did not return on the 41st day. She did not return on the 42nd. Seraphine kept working. She closed 4 more threads from the ledger: a supply contract with a northern mining cooperative, a standing arrangement with the Eastern Granary Commission, a verbal agreement with the head of the harbor authority at the coastal settlement of Vren that had never been formalized because the harbor master was the kind of man who trusted faces over paper. She traveled to Vren for that one herself, 2 days by horse, in the company of a single guard she trusted, and sat across from Aldrich Fenna in his salt-smell office and told him she was restructuring her involvement in the coastal accounts and that Administrator Corwin would be his primary contact going forward. Fenny looked at her with the expression of a man trying to calculate something he didn't have all the numbers for. He didn't ask questions. He shook her hand with both of his and held on a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She rode back through 2 days of cold northern gray and told herself Britta had been delayed by weather or road conditions or the particular complications of moving through territory that didn't appear on official maps. She told herself this with the same precision she applied to everything, not to believe it blindly, but to keep it in the column of live possibilities until the evidence required otherwise. On the 47th day, a messenger arrived from the palace. Not Britta, a palace courier in the royal livery, which meant the message had gone through official channels, which meant someone had decided it should. The message was from Lord Brant. It said, in the clean impersonal language of court administration, her personal attendant, one Britta Osen, has been detained pending inquiry into unauthorized communications. The Alpha King requests her presence at her earliest convenience. Seraphine read it twice. She set it face down on her desk. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Not the 4 count, just breathed, the way she breathed when something required her full attention and no performance. Then she stood and went to find Davin Soar. He was in the records room adjacent to the administrative office, cross-referencing something she'd asked for 2 days ago. He looked up when she came in. She said, "Who has access to Britta's personnel file?" He was very still for a moment, then, "Standard access. Lord Brant's office, the Alpha King's household staff coordinator, myself." "Did anyone request it recently?" A pause that was 1 beat longer than it should have been. Lord Brant's office sent a routine audit request for all personal attendance 3 weeks ago. It came through the standard channel. 3 weeks ago, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back, his face doing the thing it did when he was not going to say what he was thinking because he'd decided it wasn't his place. She had always respected that quality in him. She respected it now and found it insufficient. "Davin," she said, "how much of what I've been doing do you think Brant knows about?" He set down his pen. He folded his hands on the table. "Enough," he said. "Probably enough." Bats. She went to Kaelin before he could summon her. That was the only piece of control she had left to exercise, and she exercised it. He was in the war room, the large chamber off the main corridor, with the territorial map she'd commissioned, and the long table she'd had brought up from the southern woodworks, and the windows she'd specifically had positioned to face east, because he'd told her once, years ago, that he liked morning light when he was working. She remembered that. She had always remembered that. He was standing at the head of the table when she entered. Lord Brant was to his right. Commander Thrace was near the window. 2 others from the inner council were positioned at the sides of the room in the arrangement she recognized as formal inquiry. Not council session, not war planning. Inquiry. She came through the door without hesitation and stood at the opposite end of the table and waited. Kaelin said, "Close the door." She didn't move toward the door. The guard behind her closed it. "Britta Osen," Kaelin said. "My personal attendant," she said. "Yes." She was carrying correspondence through the eastern gate, unauthorized, in cipher. He set a piece of paper on the table so she could see it was one of her letters from the distance between them, recognized the handwriting, recognized the cipher that nobody in the palace was supposed to know except her. We decoded it. She looked at the paper. She did not let her face change. Who is Kael'Mira? He said. Brant was watching her with the expression of a man who had already written the conclusion and was now gathering evidence to support it. She had never liked Brant, had never trusted his particular brand of institutional loyalty, which was loyalty to position rather than to person. She had tolerated him because he was effective, and because Kaelin trusted him, and because she had spent 11 years prioritizing the Empire's function over her personal assessments. She looked back at Kaelin. A former mentor, she said, from my time in the North before we were mated. You've been corresponding with her in cipher. I correspond with her privately. In cipher, he said again. Yes. Why? She held his gaze across the long table. Behind her sternum, the mate bond registered his emotional state, tight, controlled, something that was not quite anger and not quite fear but lived in the narrow territory between them. She recognized it. She had felt it from him before, usually before a campaign, usually when something he'd expected to be stable had moved. Because she lives outside Imperial territory, she said, and I prefer my private correspondence to stay private. You're leaving, he said. Flat, not a question. The room was very quiet. She could have said no. Could have given him the vocabulary instead of the meaning, the way she had in the study 4 weeks ago. Redistributing, restructuring, accounting. She could have bought another few weeks of operational space. She looked at him and she saw in his face that he already knew, had decoded not just the letter, but the shape of the last 2 months, the transfers and the closures and the room she'd vacated without being asked again. And she understood that the time for vocabulary was over. Yes, she said. The word landed in the room like a stone. Brant moved first. A small shift, a repositioning, the body language of a man who has been waiting for confirmation and has received it and is now moving to the next operational phase. She watched him from the edge of her vision and did not look away from Kaelin. Kaelin's jaw tightened. When? I haven't set a specific date. True, now that Britta was detained and the route hadn't come back. But you've been planning it. He came around the table, set, not fast, controlled, deliberate. The movement of a man who does not want to close distance, but has decided he needs to. He stopped 4 feet from her. She did not step back. For how long? Since the banquet, she said. He exhaled hard through his nose. The mate bond spiked, something raw moving through it, unguarded. The thing he hadn't shown her since the night at the window when he'd stood in the corridor dark and sounded, briefly, like a man who didn't know what he was asking for, but knew he was losing it. You were going to disappear, he said, without a word. I was going to close everything properly first, she said. Every obligation, every open thread, every agreement this empire depends on that runs through me. I was going to make sure nothing collapsed when I was gone. She kept her voice even. That's not disappearing. That's being thorough. It's the same thing. No, she said. It's not. Disappearing is what you do when you don't care what you leave behind. I cared. I have spent 2 months caring about what I would leave behind. That should tell you something. He stared at her. Something in his face was moving under the controlled surface. She could read it even now, even standing on the far side of what they had been, because she had spent 11 years learning that face, and the knowledge didn't disappear just because the context had. I won't let you leave, he said. The room went absolutely still. She looked at him, at Brant, who had positioned himself near the door with the careful positioning of someone executing a plan, at Thrace, who was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who has decided this is not something he wants to be part of, but has not yet found the mechanism to leave. Kaelin, she said. Her voice was very quiet. What exactly do you mean by that? You are the first queen of the Iron Covenant. That title is not optional. You don't... He stopped. He pressed one hand flat on the table. You don't just walk away from this. You walked away first, she said. You walked away by degrees for 2 years, and then you walked away formally in front of 500 witnesses. I didn't try to stop you. I didn't tell you that you couldn't. That's not... He caught himself. Not the same? She tilted her head slightly. Why? Because yours was strategic and mine is personal? Because the Empire benefits from yours and inconveniences it from mine? She kept her voice level, kept the heat of it under control. Not because she wasn't angry, she had been for weeks in the careful sealed vault beneath the accounting, but because she was not going to give Brant the record of her losing composure in a formal inquiry chamber. I have spent 11 years here. I have given this empire things I cannot name in an inventory because they don't have official categories. I have the right to decide when that's done. Kalen looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Detain the attendant pending formal investigation. Restrict outgoing correspondence from the First Queen's office until further notice." Brant said, "Yes, my lord." The words landed on her like cold water. Not because they were a surprise. Somewhere in the structure of her, the part that had been paying attention for 11 years had known this was a possible move, had known that Kalen's affection for her had always coexisted with his absolute conviction that the Empire's needs superseded everything, including the people inside it. She had watched him make that calculation 100 times with other people. She had never thought he would make it with her. That was the failure of imagination she hadn't known she had. She stood in the inquiry chamber and felt the shape of what had just happened settle into clarity. Britta was detained. Her correspondence was restricted. Brant now had the letter, had the name of Kyle Mira, had the route inquiry if they pressed hard enough. The 60-day plan, the careful, methodical, thorough plan she had built precisely so that she could leave without causing damage, had been intercepted at the 47th day. She looked at Kalen. He was looking back at her with the expression of a man who has done something he knows is wrong and has decided the rationale for it is sound enough to hold the weight. She recognized that look. She had seen it the night of the banquet. "You can restrict my correspondence," she said. "You cannot restrict my judgment." He said nothing. She turned and walked out of the room. Bas. She went back to her office. She sat at her desk. She picked up her pen and set it down. The wolf in her was loud, louder than it had been since the night of the banquet, louder than the careful, controlled thing she'd kept on a short line for 2 months while she worked through the ledger. It wanted to snarl, wanted the physical expression of what she was feeling, wanted to move rather than sit in a chair and calculate. She pressed her feet flat against the floor and breathed, and let the wolf make its noise in the sealed space inside her, and did not let it drive the next decision. Because the next decision was the one that mattered. She had 92 threads left in the ledger 2 months ago. She had closed 61 of them. 31 remained. She had planned to close them systematically, cleanly, with full documentation so that the transfer of responsibility was airtight and no one could say she had abandoned anything. That plan was gone. Brant had the letter. They knew the direction. Whatever ground advantage she'd built through invisibility and patience was now in someone else's hands. They would watch the borders, watch the Eastern Passage, watch the routes out of Imperial territory that weren't on official maps but that Brant was thorough enough to have his own intelligence on. She opened her desk drawer. She took out the ledger. 31 threads. She looked at the list with different eyes now. Not the eyes of someone with months to work methodically, but the eyes of someone calculating what absolutely required her attention and what could be handed off imperfectly and what would survive on its own infrastructure without any transfer at all. Because she had built good infrastructure. She had built things to last. Not everything needed her signature to keep running. Some of it would run because she'd made it the kind of thing that ran. She went through the list with a new pen, making new marks. 12 that required her direct action and could not be delegated cleanly. 11 that Davin Sor could complete without her if she briefed him thoroughly. 8 that would hold on their own for at least a year before needing intervention. She looked at the 12. How fast could she close 12 things? She thought about it with the cold precision of someone who had spent 11 years learning the exact structural load-bearing capacity of every obligation she carried. 10 days? Maybe 8 if she moved without sleeping much. She had not slept much in months. She could do 8. She pulled a fresh sheet of correspondence paper. She did not write to Kale Mira. Her correspondence was restricted. Brant would intercept anything that went through official channels, and she had used Britta's route and couldn't use it again with Britta detained. She needed another mechanism. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote a different letter to Lady Marin Vale in language that looked like a routine administrative update on the Eastern trade ledgers, because it mostly was, with 3 lines in the middle that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know that she and Marin had spent 6 years conducting certain kinds of communication that they had never once made explicit. She sealed it. She addressed it. She sent it through the official palace postal system, the one Brant's people would read, in which case they would read an administrative update on trade ledgers. Then she opened the ledger and started on the 12 threads. Davin Sor came to her at the end of that day. He came without being summoned. He closed the door behind him and stood in front of her desk with the expression she recognized now, the one where he had decided it was finally his place to say something. "They interviewed me this afternoon," he said. She looked up. "Brant?" "Two of his people, and a member of the Alpha King's personal staff." He paused. "They asked about the inventory, about what I'd been compiling and why." "What did you tell them?" "That you had asked me to conduct a standard administrative audit, which is true." He met her eyes. "They didn't push past that." "They will." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Seraphine, how much time do you need?" She held his gaze. In 11 years, he had never used her name without a title before. She hadn't realized until this moment that she'd been waiting for it. 8 days, she said. He nodded. "Tell me what you need me to start on." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the 11 threads with his name in the margin. He looked at the list. He sat down without being invited and pulled the ledger toward him and started reading. And she turned to her own column and started writing. And for the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the room were the scratch of 2 pens and the wind outside the window and the distant routine noise of a palace that was still running on the infrastructure she had built and did not know it was 8 days from losing her. Somewhere past the eastern garden, past the wolfsbane she had planted in iron-rich soil, past the borders of every official map, a door was still open. She was going to reach it. The plan had changed. The route had changed. The timeline had compressed into something with no margin and no room for the careful and the thorough and the methodical thing she had always been. She was going to have to move differently now, faster, harder, less clean, leaving some things untied that she had wanted to close properly, trusting the infrastructure to hold where she couldn't personally seal it. She was going to have to stop being the woman who managed everything and become the woman who managed her own survival. Those were not the same skill. She was not sure she knew how to do the second one. She looked at her hands on the desk. Steady? Good. She picked up her pen. 8 days. She started writing. She closed 4 threads in the first 2 days. Not cleanly. Not the way she would have done it with time. The thorough documentation, the proper handoff meetings, the careful briefings that ensured whoever was taking over understood not just the what, but the why. The particular institutional memory that lived in her head and nowhere else. She did it fast. She wrote compressed summaries that captured the essential architecture and trusted Davin Sor to hold the rest in his memory, and she moved to the next item before the ink on the previous one was properly dry. On the 3rd day, Lord Brant's people began appearing outside her office, not blocking her, not announcing themselves as surveillance, just present. A man at the end of the corridor who was always there when she looked up, a woman near the administrative wing entrance who happened to be consulting documents every time Seraphine moved between rooms. The palace had eyes that had always been there, but they had been pointed in other directions until now. She worked through it. She moved through the corridors with the same unhurried competence she'd always projected, and she felt their eyes on her back, and she did not alter her pace. On the 4th day, Marin Vale's response came through the official postal system, in language that looked exactly like a senior noblewoman responding to a trade ledger update. 3 lines in the middle of it that nobody who hadn't spent 6 years learning to read Marin's particular kind of precise would decode as anything other than administrative confirmation. Seraphine read those 3 lines twice. She burned the letter in the office fireplace the way she burned anything she didn't want archived. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Marin had a contact in the Western Territory who moved goods, legitimate goods, trade goods, through a route that didn't cross any of the monitored eastern passes. It would take her 2 days longer than the original route. It would require her to leave with nothing that looked like leaving. No luggage, no supplies, nothing that triggered the surveillance that was now watching her movements with increasing attention. She was going to have to walk out of this palace looking like she was going somewhere inside it. She had 4 days left. She had 8 threads remaining. 3 she could close, 5 she was going to have to leave to Davin Sor with incomplete documentation and the trust that he was good enough to carry them the rest of the way. He was good enough. She knew that. The knowledge didn't make it easier. She picked up her pen and kept working. Mom. Kaylin came to her on the 6th night. She heard him in the corridor before he knocked, felt him through the mate bond first, the familiar hum of his presence, and had 2 full seconds to arrange her face and her desk and herself before his knock came at the door. "Come in," she said. He entered alone. No Brant, no counsel, no inquiry arrangement. Just him, in the plain working clothes he wore when he wasn't performing authority. Dark wool, no insignia, the clothes she had seen him in 100 times in the years when they had still shared enough hours for her to know what he wore when nobody was watching. He looked at her desk, at the stacked papers, the open ledger, the compressed documentation she had been producing for 6 days at a pace that was starting to show in the shadows under her eyes and the slight roughness of her hands from constant writing. He looked at her face. She looked back at him. "You're still working," he said. "I'm always working." He came to stand in front of the desk instead of sitting. She recognized the posture, the particular way he stood when he was trying to have a conversation and didn't trust himself sitting down for it, when he needed the ability to move. "Brant wants to formalize the restriction," he said. "Put it in writing. Official limitation on your administrative authority pending. He's calling it a stability review." "I know what he's calling it," she said. "I haven't approved it yet." She set down her pen. She looked up at him fully. "Yet." He pressed his hand flat on the desk. The same gesture she'd seen him make in the war room, the same controlled weight-bearing, the physical tell of a man holding something down that wanted to move. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Tell me what would make this—" He stopped. "Tell me what would make you stay." The question landed in the quiet office with everything it contained. The genuine weight of it. The real asking, which she had not expected and which cost her something to hear. Because it was real. She could feel it in the bond, could feel that the question came from the unguarded place rather than the political one, and she had loved him for 11 years, and the mechanisms of that love did not simply stop operating because she'd made a decision. She breathed. "There isn't anything," she said. "Seraphine, not because I don't—" She stopped. Started again. Chose precision over protection. "Not because nothing matters, but because staying requires me to stop being what I am, and you don't actually want that. You want the version of me that holds everything together and also accepts a position that makes it impossible to hold anything together with any dignity. Those 2 things can't live in the same person." His jaw worked. "I made a mistake." "You made a decision," she said. "There's a difference. A mistake is something you didn't mean. You meant it. You meant every part of it. The announcement, the timing, the public setting, the instruction to welcome her. It was calculated. I know how you think. I've watched you plan campaigns for 11 years. She kept her voice level. She was not going to give this the register of accusation because accusation required the other person to defend themselves, and she did not want his defense. She wanted to be done. You made the calculation, and the calculation was correct for the Empire and wrong for me, and I have accepted both of those things. What I cannot accept is being detained inside a life I've decided to leave." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, wind moved through the eastern garden. She heard it, the particular sound of it through wolfsbane, a soft resistance, different from the sound of roses or the sound of the empty beds that had been there when she'd first arrived and planted something in iron-rich soil that came back even when the conditions were difficult. "I can't run this empire without you," he said. "Yes, you can." She picked up her pen. "I've spent 2 months making sure of it." She heard his breathing change, a single rough exhale, the sound of a man receiving information he'd known was coming and finding that preparation made no difference to the impact. He said, "Don't go before the week is out. Give me a week." She did not answer. He left. She sat in the silence of her office and pressed her hand flat against her sternum and held the mate bond's pulse steady. His distance, his weight, the particular frequency of a man trying to hold something he had already dropped, and she breathed through it until it settled. Then she turned back to the ledger. 4 threads remaining. 3 days. Bashamut. Brant moved on the seventh morning. She didn't know the full shape of it until it was already in motion. She came into the administrative corridor and found Davensor waiting for her outside the office door with the specific stillness that meant something had happened that he had not caused and could not fix. "They've transferred the records," he said, his voice low. "Overnight. Everything from the main administrative archive, the correspondence files, the commission documentation, the oral agreement records I compiled. Brant's people pulled them under the stability review." She felt the hit of it land in her chest. Not surprise. She had known Brant was thorough, had known he was building a case for the formalized restriction. But the timing. 2 days before she needed to move. 2 days before Marin's contact would be in position. "The originals?" she asked. "Copies remain," Davin said. I made copies. Before. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I thought—" He stopped, steadied. "They're not in the archive. They're elsewhere." She looked at him. At his careful, precise face. The face of a man who had worked beside her for 6 years and had, at some point she hadn't exactly identified, made a decision about what that meant. "Where?" she said. "Somewhere Brant won't think to look for 2 more days." She held his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." He straightened. "Tell me which 3 threads are left." She told him. He went. She was crossing the main corridor toward the east wing at the second bell of afternoon when Commander Thrace fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him coming. That meant he'd been waiting, had positioned himself to intercept without it looking like an interception, which meant it wasn't official, which meant he'd come on his own without Brant's knowledge. She kept walking. So did he. "I'm not going to stop you," he said. His voice was very quiet. The register he used in field conditions when noise was a tactical liability. "That's not why I'm here." "Why are you here?" He was quiet for a few steps. Thrace was not a man who used words for anything except communication. He didn't fill silence, didn't smooth things over, had always moved through the world with the particular economy of someone who'd learned early that most speech was waste. She respected that about him. She had always worked well with him. "The eastern border," he said. "Brant has people there. He put them in position 4 days ago. Doesn't matter where you were headed originally, every standard exit is covered." She kept her pace even. "I know. The western route through the Fenwick territory." He let it sit for a beat. "Nobody's there." She looked at him sideways once. His face was angled straight ahead, jaw set, eyes on the corridor. "You didn't hear that from me," he said. He slowed his pace and peeled away from her at the next junction without ceremony, without goodbye, without looking back. She heard his footsteps recede and felt the particular weight of what had just happened settle into her chest alongside everything else she was carrying. Thrace had watched her manage this empire for 11 years, from the position of the person who actually enforced its security. He knew what she was worth. He had made his own calculation, separate from Brant's, separate from Kalen's, and it had landed differently. She filed it and kept walking. On the 7th night, she packed nothing. That was the hardest part. Not the decision, not the deadline, not even the incomplete thread she was leaving to Davensor, and the infrastructure she'd built, and the hope that good construction held under pressure. The hardest part was standing in her chambers in the dark and understanding that 11 years of a life required leaving without its objects. Her books. The correspondence she'd saved, that mattered. The single painting she'd bought from a market trader in the eastern city of Vren 6 years ago, that she'd hung on the wall beside the window because she liked looking at it in the morning. She stood in front of it for a moment. It was a landscape. Nothing identifiable, just land under a wide sky. The kind of painting that wasn't technically exceptional, but had the quality of having been made by someone who actually loved what they were looking at. She had bought it because it reminded her of the North, because it reminded her of being 19 and already mated and already afraid, and also, underneath all of it, already determined. She left it on the wall. She put on her riding clothes and her traveling cloak and her boots, the practical ones she wore for distance, and she looked at herself once in the dark mirror and then looked away and went to her desk and wrote one last thing. Not a letter. She would write the letter in the morning, in the throne room, in the one piece of theater she had left to perform, but before that, Here, in her chambers, in the last night she would spend in this palace, she wrote a single page. Not to Kaelin, not to the court. To the wolf she'd been before she came here. To the 19-year-old girl from the north who had arrived with nothing and had made this empire from the inside out, who had given everything she could carry and several things she couldn't and had never once asked to be told it was enough. She told her it was enough. She sealed it and left it on the pillow and walked out of her chambers without looking back. Woke. The palace was quiet at the third bell of night. She moved through it the way she had moved through everything for the last 7 days, with the quality of someone going somewhere ordinary, somewhere expected. Her pace, the deliberate, unhurried pace of a woman who belongs where she is and is not in any particular hurry. The guards she passed were accustomed to her late hours. She was always in the administrative wing at odd hours. She had built that reputation deliberately over 11 years without knowing she would one day need it as cover. She almost made the East Corridor. Kaelin was there. Not with guards, not with Brant or council or the formal arrangement of power. Just him, standing at the junction of the East Corridor and the main hall, in the dark, in the plain wool clothes, and she didn't understand until she was 10 feet from him how he'd known. And then she felt it, felt the mate bond surging with the proximity, felt his side of it louder than it had been in years, raw and uncontrolled and fully present in a way he hadn't let it be since the early years of their mating. She stopped. He looked at her. At the traveling clothes, the riding cloak, the practical boots, at her face in the corridor dark. Now, he said. Just the word. Not an accusation, not a question, something that had gone past both. Yes, she said. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and she held her ground, and he stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could feel the mate bond between them at full volume, the thing she had been keeping at arm's length for 2 months screaming at full power now in both directions. His hand came up. His fingers found her jaw. Not gripping, just the weight of his hand, the way he had held her face 100 times in 11 years, and she felt it go through her like current and locked every muscle she had against what it cost her. Don't, he said. His voice was completely wrecked. Seraphine, don't walk out of this palace. She felt her own breathing go rough, felt the wolf in her responding to the mate bond the way it always had, with recognition, with the bone-deep pull of it, the biological certainty that this was the person, this was the anchor, this was home. She let herself feel it fully, every layer of it, the love that was still real and the grief underneath it and the specific agony of standing in the dark with the person you had been built to be beside, and knowing with total clarity that you were going to leave anyway. You should have thought of this, she said softly. Before the banquet. I know. Before the announcement, before Brant, before... Her voice caught. One time. She let it, then brought it back. Before you decided that what I gave you was a floor to build on rather than a choice I made every single day. His hand tightened fractionally against her jaw. I can't fix the banquet, he said. I can't undo it. I know that. But I'm asking you. His voice broke on the word, and she felt it in the bond, felt the full weight of it. A king undone in a corridor in the middle of the night by the quiet leaving of the person he had taken for granted so long he'd forgotten to notice he was doing it. I am asking you to give me the chance to learn what it costs, what I actually cost you. The mate bond roared between them. She reached up and took his hand from her face. She held it for exactly 1 moment, felt the roughness of it, the size of it, the hand she had held through campaigns and grief and the long dark years when the empire had been something they were building together rather than something she was maintaining alone. She held it for 1 moment. She lowered it. You'll learn it either way, she said. That's the difference between us. I learned without making you watch. She stepped around him. He didn't stop her. She heard his breathing behind her, Mile, ragged, the breathing of a man who has reached for the thing he should have held and found his hands empty. And she walked down the east corridor and through the passage and into the cold outer air, where the night was dark and the wind was from the west, and somewhere through the Fenwick territory, 2 days from here, a road existed that didn't appear on any official map. She did not look back. The mate bond pulled at her with everything it had, screamed at her spine, at her heels, at every instinct she'd been born with. And she walked through it the way she walked through everything that had tried to stop her for 11 years, which was the only way she knew how. Forward, without stopping, without looking back. The palace wall fell behind her. The eastern garden, her garden, passed on her left. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She knew what grew there. She had put it there herself, in iron-rich soil, precisely because she'd wanted something that came back even when the conditions were difficult. The gate, the open road, the dark. She walked into it. And in the palace behind her, in the corridor where she had left him, Kalen Draven stood alone with his hands empty and the mate bond going quieter with every step she took, felt her walking away from him through the bond, the way you felt blood leaving a wound, slow and then faster, and then the dull cold of a thing that had been warm, and understood, for the first time, with the complete and devastating clarity that only comes when the thing is already gone, exactly what he had done. And in Brant's office, 2 floors up, a report was being written. She was already past the walls before they would read it. The road west was cold and dark and entirely her own. She rode through the first night without stopping, not because she was afraid of pursuit, though she was not naive about it, but because movement was the only thing her body knew how to do with what she was carrying. The mate bond thinned as she put distance between herself and the palace, the way a rope thins when you unwind it fiber by fiber, each mile pulling another thread loose until what remained was an echo rather than a current. She felt it go. She let herself feel it go. She did not look back at the road behind her, but she felt every increment of distance in her chest, in the place the bond had lived for 11 years, the hollow that opened as it quieted. By dawn, she had crossed the Fenwick border. By the second dawn, she had found the contact Marin's letter had described, a trader named Goss, broad and weathered, who moved preserved goods through the Western Passage and asked no questions about what she was carrying because she was carrying nothing, which he took in without comment. He gave her a seat in his wagon and a blanket that smelled like pine resin and salt, and she slept for the first time in days, rocking through territory that didn't appear on any official map, while the empire fell behind her like a coastline disappearing below the horizon. She did not dream. Kyle Mira was 61 years old and had the eyes of someone who had been paying attention for all of them. She met Seraphine at the edge of her settlement on the 3rd day, a compound of low stone buildings and working land set into a hillside above a river that ran clean and fast over pale rock. There were wolves here, a dozen at least that Seraphine could feel before she saw, moving through the compound with the ease of people who had learned to belong somewhere after being told they didn't. Kale looked at her for a long moment before she spoke. Then she said, "You look like you haven't slept in a month." "Longer," Seraphine said. Kale put her hands on Seraphine's face, the gesture of a woman who had earned that kind of contact, who had been the person Seraphine went to at 19 when she had nothing else, and looked at her with the same direct assessment she'd always had, the kind that didn't require anything to be said before it reached an accurate conclusion. "Come inside," she said. "Eat something." Seraphine came inside. She sat at a wooden table in a stone room that smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs, and ate the first full meal she'd managed to get down in a week. And for a long time, neither of them said anything, because Kale had always understood that there was a kind of exhaustion that speech couldn't help. Eventually, Kale said, "How much did you manage to close?" 132 of 163. Kale was quiet for a moment. "And the rest?" "Davin Soar," Seraphine said. "He's good enough. He'll hold them." Kale looked at her with the expression Seraphine remembered from her training years, the expression that meant she was being assessed on something that hadn't been named yet. "And the bond," Kale said. Seraphine set down her fork. "Thinning. You used the ancient severance law." "I filed the documentation before I left. With the court archivist, the one Brant doesn't control. It'll process in 30 days without Kalen's signature under the terms of the old covenant." She had researched that law 6 weeks into her planning, had found it in a legal archive that nobody had consulted in 4 decades because nobody had needed it. A queen could sever the mate bond unilaterally under covenant law if the conditions of partnership had been substantively altered without her consent. The language was archaic, but the mechanism was real. By the time anyone thinks to contest it, it'll be done. Kale was quiet for a long time. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Seraphine looked at the table, at her hands, rough from weeks of constant writing, the ink still faintly visible in the lines of her knuckles. She thought about the corridor, about his hand on her jaw, about the sound of his breathing when she stepped around him. She thought about 11 years of mornings and the particular quality of his voice in the unguarded register and every version of herself she had brought to that empire and left there. "Yes," she said. "Good," Kale said, not unkindly. "That means it was real. Real things hurt when you leave them." She reached across the table and put her hand over Seraphine's. "The hurt doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you made a human one." Seraphine looked at the hand covering hers. She felt something move through her. Not the bond, that was already 200 miles and thinning, but something older, something that had been waiting underneath the accounting and the planning and the careful methodical work of the last 2 months, something that had no name and needed none. She breathed, and for the first time in 11 years, she let herself not know what came next. The first month in the settlement was the hardest. Not because the work was hard, it was, but hard work had always been where she lived. Not because of the wolves she was learning alongside, the displaced and the discarded and the ones who had been told by someone with authority that they didn't fit the shape required. She understood them without needing their histories. The hardest part was the silence where the mate bond had been. It was fully severed by the end of the first month. She felt it go on an ordinary morning. She was in the East Field with a woman named Sela, who was teaching her how the settlement managed its water rights, and she stopped mid-sentence and put her hand over her sternum and felt the last fiber of it release, felt the absence close over like water closing over a stone. Sela stopped, looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," Seraphine said, and then, because it was true and because she was learning to stop performing steadiness when she didn't have to, "No. Give me a moment." She stood in the field with her hand over her chest, and she let herself feel the full shape of what was gone. Not the love, that was more complicated. That was going to take longer than a month to understand, but the bond itself, the 11-year hum of another person's presence that had been so constant, she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. It was gone now. The silence where it had been was enormous. She stood in it. She did not try to fill it. After a while, she took her hand from her chest and looked at Sela, who was waiting with the particular patience of someone who had waited through worse. "Water rights," Seraphine said. "You were saying the Eastern allocation is disputed." Sela looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite respect and not quite recognition, but lived between them. "That's right," she said. "Come look at the channel." Seraphine followed her. Dutch. She learned the settlement the way she had learned the empire, through its infrastructure, through the relationships that held it, through the particular texture of what made it function. She learned what Kale had built here over 20 years, a working community for wolves who had been cast out of packs, ejected by mates, left behind by the structures that were supposed to hold them. They were healers, farmers, traders, builders, teachers. They were people who had been defined by what they'd lost until they'd built something of their own. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had skills here she'd never been able to use fully in the palace. Not the diplomatic architecture, not the administrative infrastructure. Those were useful, but not primary. What they needed was the thing she'd always done, but had never been allowed to name as the core of what she was. She saw systems. She saw where the load-bearing walls were, and where the weak points were, and what small adjustments would prevent large collapses. And she applied that vision to the settlement with the same precision she'd applied it to an empire. But here nobody argued about whether the insight was hers. Here, it was simply hers. She started with the water rights dispute, then the winter supply allocation that had been causing low-level conflict between 3 of the compound's main households for 2 seasons. Then the trading relationship with the nearest border settlement, which had been underperforming because the terms hadn't been renegotiated in a decade, and the people doing the negotiating hadn't realized the original terms had been designed for a different scale. She worked. She built. She did it without being asked, without seeking acknowledgement, and discovered something she hadn't known about herself in 11 years of palace life. She didn't actually need the acknowledgement. She had thought she'd transcended the need for it, had told herself that all those years of doing unattributed work were an expression of her commitment to the empire, rather than an expression of what had been taken from her. She had been wrong about that. What she'd been doing in the palace was surviving without acknowledgement. What she was doing here was thriving without needing it. The difference was not small. The news from the Draven Empire came in pieces, the way news always traveled through unofficial territory, traders, border communities, the specific rumor networks that existed between places that didn't talk to each other officially. The first piece came 4 months out. House Vale had formally withdrawn a portion of its eastern trade support. Not dramatically, not with declaration, but the kind of quiet structural withdrawal that Seraphine could read the mechanics of from 300 miles away. Marin Vale, executing the arithmetic she'd predicted the night of the banquet. The second piece came 6 months out. The Northern Grain Commission had defaulted on a quarterly obligation because the administrator handling it had made an incorrect assumption about a provision that Seraphine had always managed from institutional memory rather than formal documentation. The assumption had seemed reasonable and had been wrong, and it had cost the Empire a seasoned supply agreement with the Northern Cooperative that had spent 8 years being carefully cultivated. The third piece came almost a year after she left. Kaelin had convened an emergency council session to address structural instability in 4 of the Empire's 7 administrative regions simultaneously. The source who brought this information to the settlement was a trader who had it third hand and couldn't confirm the specific details, so she held it loosely and didn't draw conclusions. But she knew what 4 simultaneous administrative instabilities felt like. She had managed them before. Not simultaneously because she had caught them before they reached that level. She sat with the news in the evening after the trader had gone, in the small room that was hers now. Stone-walled, low-ceilinged, with a window that faced east because she'd asked for it, because she still liked morning light. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not the vindication of "I told you what you'd lose." Something quieter and more complicated. Something that looked, when she examined it honestly, like grief. Not for herself. For the cooperative farmers in the north who'd lost a supply agreement they'd worked 8 years to secure. For the administrators doing their best with imperfect documentation. For the empire she'd loved, actually, had loved despite everything. Had given herself to with genuine commitment because the work itself had been real and the people inside it had been real, and none of that changed because Kaelin had made a decision that broke something irreparably. She could grieve the empire without wanting to go back to it. That distinction was new. She turned it over in her hands like something found on a riverbank, solid and unexpected. Tess. He came in the second year. She felt him before she saw him. Not the bond, that was long gone, but the particular sensation of knowing, the way you know weather before it arrives if you've been paying attention long enough to read the signs. One of the settlement's perimeter watchers came to find her in the North Field, where she was supervising a drainage project with Sela and 2 of the younger wolves. Someone at the boundary, the watcher said, came alone. No imperial insignia. Says he's not here officially. She straightened. She looked at the watcher. Description, he told her. She handed Scylla the survey notes she'd been holding and said, "Keep going without me," and walked toward the boundary. Kaelin was waiting at the edge of the settlement's marked territory outside the boundary line, which was where she had told the watchers to stop visitors if they came from the Empire. He had honored it, had stopped at the line, was standing on the outside of it, which meant he had come here knowing that was the rule and had chosen to follow it. He looked different, not in the way that 2 years aging would produce. He was weathered, yes, but that wasn't it. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together by a process that had not been gentle and had not left the pieces in the same arrangement. She stopped 10 feet from him. The settlement behind her, the open land behind him. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She waited. She had always been better at waiting. "You were right," he said, "about everything." I know, she said. The Empire is... He stopped. It's holding. It's not what it was. Brant is gone. I removed him 6 months after you left, when I understood what he'd done with the intelligence he'd gathered. Thrace is running security now. House Vale came back to the table when I acknowledged formally in council what the administrative record showed about who had actually built what. He paused. Your name is in the official record now. Every initiative, every reform, your name is on it. She looked at him, at his face in the afternoon light, at the particular weight in it that she recognized as something he had earned, not inherited, the specific heaviness of a person who has looked clearly at what they have done and carried it without flinching. That's good, she said. For the Empire. I didn't come to tell you about the Empire, he said. I know why you came. He held her gaze. His hands were at his sides, not reaching, not performing any gesture that asked for something, just his hands, open, at his sides. She noticed that. It was a new thing. The Kaelin she had known for 11 years had never stood in front of her without occupying the space with certainty. This was a different posture. This was a man standing in his own uncertainty and not trying to fill it. I came to ask you something, he said, not to ask you to come back. I know that's not... He stopped, breathed. I know. She waited. I came to ask if you're all right, he said. That's all. I spent a year not knowing, and I... His voice roughened, and he held it steady through force of will. I needed to see that you were. She looked at him for a long time. Around her, the settlement moved in its afternoon rhythms. The sounds of the north field work, the river in the distance, the particular texture of a place that had been built by people who had survived what they'd been told they couldn't survive and had built something from the far side of it. She had spent 2 years becoming one of those people. She had been, she realized, always one of those people. She had simply needed to get far enough away from the place that had been defining her by its terms to understand her own. I'm all right, she said. He exhaled. The sound of it carried everything. 2 years of wait, 2 years of consequence, 2 years of a man sitting in the wreckage of his own decisions and trying to understand them clearly rather than explain them away. Good, he said. Kaelin. She took 1 step forward, not toward him, not closing the distance, just a small adjustment that changed the angle between them. What you did to the record, acknowledging it properly, in council, that mattered. Not to me. To the people who were in those rooms and watched it happen and understood what it cost you to say it. She looked at him steadily. That was the right thing. It was late, but it was right. Something moved through his face. It should have been from the beginning. Yes, she said. It should have. The word landed between them and settled. Not an accusation. Not forgiveness. An accounting. The kind she had always been good at. The kind that named what was true without deciding what it required next. He looked at the settlement behind her, at the building lines, the working land, the river, at the wolves moving through the compound with the ease of people who had found ground that held them. You built this, he said. Not a question. Something in his voice that was the closest thing to wonder she had heard from him. Kale built it, she said. I'm helping. That's not... Seraphine. His voice was low. I recognize what you've done here from the way a place feels when the right person has been working in it. I spent 11 years living in a place that felt that way because of you. He paused. I knew it. I knew it the whole time. He stopped. Didn't think it required tending, she said. Yes. The word cost him something. She looked at him. At this man she had loved for 11 years, in the specific and exhausting way that people love people who take them for granted, fully, without reserve, in constant hope that the fullness of it would eventually register. She had stopped hoping. She had left. She had built something else. She did not love him the way she had. The bond was gone and she had grieved it, and what remained was something more complicated. The permanent texture of someone who had mattered enormously and had also caused enormous damage, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. She forgave him. She felt it as she stood there, not as a decision reached through reasoning, but as something that had been arriving for months and had simply finished arriving in this moment, in this afternoon light, in front of this man who had come alone and stood outside the boundary line and asked only if she was all right. She forgave him without telling him. That was hers. It didn't belong in the space between them. Go home, she said. Your empire needs you. Lead it the way you've learned to, and remember what it costs to learn. His jaw worked. Is there... He stopped. Is there nothing? There's nothing, she said. It was not cruel. It was the cleanest and most honest thing she had given him in 11 years. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly. The nod of a man who had come for one question and received the answer and understood that receiving it was what he'd actually needed, even if it wasn't what he'd hoped. He turned. He walked back toward the road, toward the horse he'd left beyond the boundary. She watched him go. The mate bond was gone, and the space where it had been was no longer hollow. She noticed that standing there, noticed that at some point in the last 2 years, the silence had filled with something else, with the sound of the river and the north field and Selah's voice and Kail's steady presence and the particular weight of work that belonged to her completely. The hollow had become room. She had not realized that was possible. She was grateful to have been wrong about it. She stood at the boundary of the place she had built until Kaelin's shape disappeared over the rise in the road. Then she turned back. Mentit. In the years that followed, the Draven Empire found its footing under Kaelin's harder and more honest leadership. House Vale returned fully. The Northern cooperative agreements were renegotiated with proper documentation. Thrace ran security with the blunt competence that had always been his primary quality. Illyra, to her credit, turned out to have a genuine facility for Southern diplomacy that Seraphine could acknowledge from a distance as a real skill, not a fabricated one. She had simply not been built for the whole thing, and in a court that understood her actual scope, she did real work. The Empire did not thrive the way it had thrived. Something was different in its texture, in the quality of its function. The people who had been in those rooms understood what was different. Some of them said so, quietly, in the way people say true things they've learned they can't say loudly. Seraphine's name stayed in the record. In the settlement past the western border, the thing she and Kael and the others were building grew. It grew not because she had decided to build something great, not because she was trying to prove something to an empire that had decided she was expendable, but because she was good at this and she had finally found a place that let her be good at it without conditions. There were 40 wolves in the settlement by the 3rd year, 60 by the 5th. They came from packs that had cast them out, from courts that had decided they were inconvenient, from mates who had chosen differently and left them standing in corridors holding what remained. They came having been defined by their losing, and they were, slowly, difficult, at different paces, learning to define themselves by what they were building instead. She did not tell them her history. They mostly knew pieces of it, the way people in small communities know pieces of each other through proximity and time. She did not correct the pieces or fill in the gaps. What she had been was not what she was, and what she was now was what she chose to be each morning when she rose before the settlement was awake and stood at the east window and watched the light come over the hills and felt, in the particular quality of that silence, the precise contour of who she had become. A woman who had given an empire everything she was. A woman who had known when to stop giving. A woman who had walked out of a palace in traveling clothes with nothing in her hands and had found, on the far side of everything that walking had cost her, that her hands were still the same hands, that what she could build had not been the palace's, that it had always been hers. The wolfsbane she planted on the eastern slope of the settlement's hill grew back every spring in the iron-rich soil of the hillside, pale and persistent and indifferent to the difficulty of the conditions. She had chosen it deliberately. She knew what she was choosing. She stood at the window in the early morning light and breathed, and the light came over the hills, and the settlement began to wake around her, and she was not happy in the way that songs described happiness, was not without grief, was not without the permanent texture of everything she had carried and everything she had left. But she was something more durable than happy. She was whole. That was the thing nobody had told her about survival, that it was not an ending. It was not the moment you escaped, or the day the bond severed, or the night you walked through the gate with empty hands. Survival was the 1,000 ordinary mornings on the far side of all of that. The work you chose, the ground you built, the person you became when no one else was defining the terms. The light reached the window. She breathed. Outside, the wolfsbane moved in the early wind, bending and coming back, bending and coming back, the way things do when they have been planted in difficult soil by someone who understood exactly what they were choosing to grow. She turned from the window. The settlement was waiting. She went to meet it,